in a quiet valley where church bells still rang on time, and the air carried the smell of old wood and candle wax, there lived a nun named Sister Amara, whose life had become a living testimony shaped by a warning she once heard and could never forget, a warning spoken centuries ago by St. John Vianney, yet echoing as if it was spoken yesterday, a warning to parents that careless faith could lead children toward sacrilege, not through hatred of God, but through neglect, comfort, and silence. Sister Amara had not always worn a veil, for she was once a schoolteacher, living an ordinary life, watching families bring their children to church on feast days, dressed well but restless, whispering, laughing, checking time, receiving holy things with hands that had never been taught what holy meant. And she remembered how her own childhood had been shaped by similar habits, where prayer was rushed, mass was optional, and reverence was explained as something old people cared about. And she remembered how confusion had grown in her heart because no one had told her why the altar mattered, why the Eucharist was sacred, or why God was not a guest but the center. Years later, while teaching catechism as a volunteer, she came across the words of St. John Vianney in a dusty book, words that struck her like a bell in the night, saying that parents who did not teach their children reverence were leading them to sacrilege without knowing it, and she felt those words burn because she could see them alive in her classroom, in children who knew prayers by sound but not by meaning, who approached holy things like ordinary objects, and who carried no sense of awe because awe had never been modeled at home. Sister Amara began to watch parents closely, not with anger but with sorrow, seeing how love was real yet misdirected, how they worked hard, provided food, comfort, and education, yet left the soul hungry, assuming faith would grow on its own, forgetting that children learn what they see, not what they are told once a year. And she saw how Sundays were filled with sports, screens, and errands, with Mass fitted in only if convenient, and how children learned from this silent lesson that God ranked lower than schedules. One evening, after a long day of teaching, she stayed alone in the chapel, kneeling before the tabernacle, feeling a deep ache for the children she taught, and in that silence she felt called not just to teach lessons, but to live as a sign, to become someone who could show reverence through her life. And that was when the idea of religious life stopped, feeling distant, and began to feel like a response. After entering the convent, Sister Amara's days became simple but intense, filled with prayer, work, and quiet encounters with visitors who came seeking peace, and many of them were parents who did not know why their children were drifting from faith, who spoke of rebellion, boredom, and disrespect. And Sister Amara listened carefully, hearing behind their words the same pattern again and again, a pattern St. John Vianney had seen long ago, where children were brought to the sacraments without preparation. Of the heart, where confession was rushed or skipped, where Holy Communion became routine instead of sacred, and where parents unknowingly taught their children that sacred things could be handled without care. She never blamed these parents harshly, because she knew they loved their children deeply. But she gently shared stories, not lectures, stories of children who had once asked innocent questions about God and stopped asking because no one answered seriously. Stories of teenagers who rejected faith, not because they hated God, but because they never learned why he mattered, and stories of her own past confusion, when holy things felt empty because no one had taught her to be still before them. The warning of St. John Vianney became a lens through which she saw everything, not as a threat, but as a cry of love, reminding parents that the greatest inheritance they could give was not success or comfort, but reverence, because without reverence, faith becomes fragile, and fragile faith breaks under pressure. Sister Amara began visiting families when invited, sitting at kitchen tables, watching how prayers were said quickly or skipped entirely, how children were corrected for manners but not for mockery of sacred things, and she noticed how parents feared being strict about faith, worrying their children would resist. Yet she saw that children actually longed for meaning and structure. Even if they resisted at first, she often remembered one boy from her class who once asked why people knelt in church, and when no clear answer came from home, he stopped kneeling altogether, not out of rebellion, but because meaning had been removed. And that memory stayed with her as proof that neglect could wound faith just as deeply as rejection. Through all this, Sister Amara carried a quiet urgency, knowing that sacrilege was not always loud or intentional, but often silent and slow. B. Born from routine without reverence, from sacraments received without preparation, and from parents who loved God but did not realize how deeply their example shaped their children's souls. And her life as a nun became a living testimony meant to awaken hearts gently, reminding families that holiness begins at home, in small acts of respect, silence, prayer, and example, long before a child ever approaches the altar. As the years passed, Sister Amara's presence became a quiet light for many families, not because she spoke loudly or dramatically, but because her life carried a calm seriousness that made people reflect on their own habits, and parents often noticed how their children behaved differently around her, lowering their voices, asking questions, becoming curious about prayer, and this surprised them, leading Sister Amara to explain gently that children respond to what they sense as meaningful, and when adults treat holy things with care, children naturally follow. She often shared how St. John Vianney had spent countless hours in the confessional, weeping for souls, especially for families who did not understand the weight of their role, and she explained that his warning was not meant to shame parents but to awaken them, because parents stand as the first teachers of reverence, long before priests or catechists enter a child's life. She spoke about sacrilege not as a frightening word, but as a painful reality, where something sacred is treated as ordinary, and she helped parents see that this could happen through simple actions, like allowing children to receive sacraments without understanding, or speaking casually about holy things, or skipping prayer without explanation. And she reminded them that children learn faith through daily life, more than formal lessons. Sister Amara herself lived carefully, moving slowly in the chapel, bowing deeply, remaining silent. Tea after prayer, knowing that these actions spoke louder than words, and many children who visited the convent asked her why she was so quiet in church, giving her the chance to explain that silence is a way of listening to God, a lesson many of them had never heard before. Parents who watched these interactions often felt a gentle discomfort, realizing that they had filled their homes with noise and activity, but little space for stillness, and Sister Amara encouraged them to start small, with short prayers, moments of gratitude, and simple explanations of why faith mattered, reminding them that perfection was not required, only sincerity and effort. She shared fictionalized yet familiar stories of families who slowly changed, who began preparing their children for Mass by speaking about it on the way, who explained confession as healing instead of punishment, and who taught their children to approach the Eucharist with clean hearts and quiet minds. And she described how these children began to change, becoming more thoughtful, more respectful, and more curious about God. Through her testimony, Sister Amara made it clear that the warning of St. John Vianney was also an invitation to reclaim the sacred within the family, to realize that parents do not lead their children to holiness through force, but through example, patience, and love, rooted in truth. She often reminded parents that children notice contradictions quickly, noticing when adults demand respect for rules but show little respect for prayer, and she urged them to examine their own habits, not with guilt but with honesty, because children learn faith by watching how adults live it when no one is looking. Sister Amara also acknowledged the challenges of modern life, the pressure of work, the pull of technology, and the fear of being judged, and she reassured parents that God works through imperfect efforts. But she also emphasized that neglect has consequences, not as punishment from God, but as a natural loss of meaning, where children grow up without understanding why faith should matter in difficult moments. She recalled many conversations with young adults who had drifted away from the church, who told her they never felt taught, never felt guided, and never felt that faith was important at home. And these stories reinforced the truth of St. John Vianney's warning, showing that spiritual neglect leaves lasting wounds. Sister Amara's testimony became a mirror for many, helping parents see that leading children away from reverence often happens unintentionally, through silence, distraction, and fear of commitment. And she encouraged them to reclaim their role with courage, reminding them that children are not harmed by seeing faith taken seriously, but strengthened by it. Through her life and words, Sister Amara continued to plant seeds, trusting that God would bring growth, knowing that every small act of reverence could heal what neglect had damaged, and that every parent who chose to live faith openly could protect their children from treating sacred things lightly, keeping alive the warning of St. John Vianney, not as a threat, but as a loving call to awaken, to teach, and to live the sacred daily. In the quiet rhythm of convent life, Sister Amara never believed her task was to change the world in loud or visible ways, yet she understood that hearts changed when truth was lived faithfully and patiently, and as she grew older, her words became fewer but her witness stronger, leaving behind memories in families who had once sat at her table and later returned with gratitude, speaking of children who now knelt willingly, asked deeper questions, and approached the sacraments with care rather than habit. These parents slowly realized that St. John Vianney's warning had not been a condemnation but a mercy, a reminder that God entrusted children to them not only to raise them for this world, but to guide them toward eternity, and that neglecting the sacred, even unintentionally, could shape a child's soul in ways that echoed far beyond childhood. Sister Amara often said softly that reverence is a language children understand without words, and that when parents choose to live faith with sincerity, humility, and visible love for God, children are protected from sacrilege because they learn that holy things are not ordinary, and that God is not an afterthought but a living presence. When her strength finally weakened and her steps slowed, the chapel remained full of the same silence she had loved, yet it was no longer empty of her influence, for her testimony continued through the families she had touched, through parents who now prayed with their children, prepared them for the sacraments with care, and understood that faith must be taught before it can be chosen. In this way, Sister Amara's life became a gentle answer to the warning of St. John Vianney, showing that while parents may unknowingly lead children toward sacrilege through neglect, they can just as powerfully lead them toward holiness through example, reverence, and love, and that when the sacred is honored in daily life, the soul of a child is not burdened but strengthened, ready to walk toward God with understanding, freedom, and hope.